Welcome to an RPG in a Box Basics video tutorial. In this video, we're going to take a look at how interaction works in free movement. I'm going to talk about how it works and things to bear in mind with the way it works. And then at the very end of the video, I will talk about a custom function that you can write that will make interacting with things in free movement just a lot easier if you're struggling with getting certain things to be interactable. So the first part of this video is to talk about how free movement works so you can get an understanding of what the problem might be in your situation, so you can sort of diagnose it for yourself. And if you can't get it to work, then at the very end of the video, the custom function will hopefully get rid of all problems that can't be resolved by just understanding how it works, if that makes sense. So either way, hopefully by the end of this video, one way or another, if you are currently experiencing issues with free movement interaction, whether it be in a standard game or a first-person game, you should be able to fix those one way or another by the end of this video. Okay. So let's start by taking a look at how free movement works how interaction works in free movement. So I've set this map up here to be free movement, and the first thing you should do when you're diagnosing issues with free movement is go to the settings section of RPG in a Box, go to the quick play section and enable the collision debugging, because collision is how free movement works. Literally everything in free movement is about collision. Okay. So let's just go into game for a moment. So here we are in a free movement standard game, okay? And this is what the game will look like when you enable the collision debugging. So you'll see how everything in the game world has like a blue mesh outline to it. Now, depending on what mesh your models are using, whether you're using the one that's generated by the voxel editor by default, or whether you're using a custom mesh, these blue outlines may look more intricate or simple, right? So for example, the mesh around these trees, you can see all the different sort of triangles and vertices that make up the collision mesh. Same with the sort of arch on the door. You can see how every bit of the arch has a separate line being drawn for it. Same with the line across the door and things like that. So this is your sort of standard auto-generated mesh that the voxel editor will generate for most objects, okay? So these blue meshes dictate collision. So you can see that the player, and over here Sarah as well, has a simpler box around them, but they still have this blue box. Everything has a blue box around it if it's got collision, okay? So these rocks over here, for example, they have the mesh around them, and as soon as the blue, you can't really see it on the player, but if I walk over the lake for a moment, a river, you can see the blue mesh around the player model, yeah? That sort of rectangle that's around the player. As soon as the rectangle of the player hits the blue mesh of the rock, that's when I'll stop moving, yeah? Because now the collision of the player is colliding with the mesh of the rocks, giving you a physical object that stops your movement, okay? Same with the tree. Now I'm colliding with the tree. Same with an NPC. As soon as our boxes touch together, that's when you can't move anymore. So collision is important not only, however, for affecting where characters and players can and can't move. It's also for interaction purposes. Now, notice how there's a yellow line that's coming out from the player. Rotate the camera around a little bit. You can see this yellow line here that's coming straight down at a 45-degree angle, coming down from the player's head down towards the ground. And it comes down at a sort of 16 by 16 distance, or at a tile's distance, okay? Now, notice how as I walk around, it's yellow. okay? But notice what happens when I walk up to these rocks. Boom, it goes red. Let's do that again. Let's go to the smaller rock just here. Boom, it goes red, okay? The little teeny tiny box that's right in front, this one here, this little teeny tiny box, okay? Because it's got a collision mesh on it. If you look close enough, you can see it's got a collision box around it, okay? So this yellow line has gone red the moment it hits a box with collision, okay? Same with this tree. If I get to a point where I can get this line to hit the tree, it goes red. The moment this line hits a collision mesh, it goes red. Now this line that we're looking at currently is the interaction line. It's what governs what you can interact with or not in free movement. So for example, the trees don't have any scripts on them. They're not interactable objects, okay? However, so what I want to do is I want to make a script for this chest. We'll just do a quick script that makes it say hello world, okay? And we'll apply and save that. So now this is an interactable object. It's not just an object, it's an interactable object. Let's go back into game. So now let's go back to our chest. So notice now how the line has gone red because we've collided with the chest. But now if you look in the bottom right corner, we also get the interact prompt. That appears when this line collides with a mesh, and that mesh is an interactable object. It's an object that has an interact event on it. On character interacts with a script assigned to it. In this case, if I press E, I get a display message, hello world, okay? Let's also add a script to this fireplace, or this torch, sorry, that I made earlier, where it has a extra frame on it. Self.frame equals 4. Validate, okay. So here we are back again once in game. So let's now go and take a look at the torch object. So let's go down here. And then as soon as I can get close enough, there we go. As soon as the line hits the torch, we get the E interact prompt. The line goes red because it's now collided with this mesh on the torch. So if I press E, I can turn off the torch. Okay? That's what the frame does. It just removes the fire and removes the light source. Okay? So, however, notice how, in order to be able to interact with an object, I have to get that yellow line to hit the chest, right? If that line wasn't currently on, if we couldn't see that line, if we turned off collision debugging, it wouldn't be clear why we can't interact with this chest, because we're standing in front of it. You know, if you're familiar, for example, with grid mode, you should be able to interact with that chest because it's the tile in front, right? So why can't I interact with it? It's because the line isn't hitting it, right? So I have to come down a bit and then turn, and now it's collided with it, so it's gone red, and now the interact prompt appears, right? So it's very clear that it's a finicky process because it has to hit a mesh. So let me show you, for example, this torch is particularly fiddly because this line is going down to the ground, right? So the path of this model that it needs to hit before I can interact with it is the tiny base at the bottom, okay? Now, if I move forward, eventually that line will hit the bigger top bit, boom, and now I can interact, but I'm now almost upon it. But that's just because I'm not lined up with it properly, right? But if I walk back and line myself up with it, now I can interact with it further away because I'm now lined up with the thinner, smaller part of the model, okay? So one way to make your interactions less fiddly is to go into the editor. Let's load up our fire torch lamp model. And you want to go to collision. If I can find it. There you go, collision override. Add a custom box cube. Okay. Now this is a bit exaggerated. You don't necessarily have to make it this big. But let's, just for demonstration purposes, we'll leave it this size so you can see the effect that it has. So if we now go across the bridge, you can now see that around the torch is a much larger collision box, okay? So now all I need to do is to hit that collision box. If I press E from here, I'm nowhere near the torch, really. I mean, as I say, this is an exaggerated example, okay? But if I press E now, I've just turned off the torch because my line from coming down from the player is hitting that collision box, okay? So by making a collision box much bigger than the object will make your objects less fiddly to interact with, okay? Now, it's important to stress that when it comes to first person, it works a bit differently. This is just for standard. We will get to first person in a minute, but I just want to start by explaining how free movement just generally works, how interaction just generally works with free movement. Now, another thing you need to bear in mind, let's leave this as custom, but let's delete the collision mesh. In other words, this now no longer has a collision mesh because we've set it to custom. We've overwritten the one generated by the Vox editor, but we haven't given it one. So in other words, it does not have a collision mesh. What happens in that case? So let's now go across the bridge, and now we can see that there's no blue box around the fire torch at all because we haven't given it a collision. Now this is going to create two problems. First of all, I can walk right through the torch, but notice how the yellow line never collides. It never goes red, and because it never goes red, I can't interact. I now just cannot interact with this torch at all because it's got zero collision. It is not colliding with this interaction line that's coming down from the player at all. And so it's completely disabled that object's ability to be interactable. So do make sure as well that your objects have collision, right? I should also mention as well, keep saying objects, but this applies to characters too, okay? So Sarah, for example, the line can go red the moment it interacts with her collision box as well, okay? So the same things apply, character and object, you know? So these are the things to bear in mind. The collision is so important in free movement. So make sure you're using the collision, of course, but also make sure you're using this view here, collision debugging, because it will not only show you the collision of all the models, including you, but it will also show you this line, and therefore you can use that line to diagnose what might be going wrong with your interactable objects. Why are they not interacting? It might be because they've got no collision, or it might be because the collision mesh is so small that it's a really complicated process to get this lined up, or fiddly process, sorry, to get this lined up. You have to be standing in a very particular spot to get the line to hit the collision. Solution to that would be maybe make a bigger collision around your box or around your object, okay? As I say, it doesn't need to be as exaggerated as we made the torch earlier. It's just to show you that if we made it exaggerated, we can interact with it much further away. So what I wanted to talk about before we move on is what governs this yellow line that's coming out from the player. Like, where's it coming from? Can you change that? And where does it go to? So you can't change where it goes to. It's always going to go out set distance, but you can change where it comes out from the player. So at the moment it's coming down from what looks like the lower head of the player, like the bottom of the head of the player, okay, the chin, if you will, or the mouth. It looks like it's sort of coming out of that area, okay? It's actually coming out from the player models. Let's load the player model up. It's coming out from the vision height, okay? So it's coming out from 12 voxels high, okay? So if we set this to 4, for example, save the model and go into game, you'll see the effect. Now you'll see that it's coming out from a much more delicate area. But I'm not sure if it's shorter, but you can see at the very least that the angle has changed. It's now, because it's coming down from a lower part of the model, it's going to affect what it's able to hit on the way down, right? So let's go across the bridge for a minute. So we can still interact as soon as the line hits something, you know. So it might have not a huge amount of effect on your ability to interact with things, but it's important to know that that's the setting that affects where the line starts from the player, and then it goes out and down, okay? Out and down in front. So let's try, if we can, setting it higher. So this model, for example, is 20 high. So let's just see what effect that has if we set the vision height to, I don't know, 18, something like that. So it's not quite the full height, but so now it's sort of coming out, as you can see, 2 voxels above the head of the player pretty much. And that will give the player, in this case, when it's standing sideways, a much, like a literal 45-degree slope going down within which to catch something if they're facing sideways. Again, you can see the effect that it's having on the line. The higher it is, the more the steeper the angle at which the line is going to come down to the tile in front. But I don't think it actually changes the distance. It just imagine that line is always the same length, but by changing the vision height, you're just sort of flattening it out, right? So you're laying it progressively more and more flat on the ground. Okay, so you could, if for example, you set the vision height to 1, where it's coming out of his foot, then it would literally be just a straight line coming out of the ground, which would be fine for getting things that are colliding on the ground. But if something was floating in the air and it was interactable, you would never be able to, the line would never hit it, so you wouldn't ever detect it. So 12 is the default, but obviously if you're changing the vision height for your model, just understand that will affect that line that's coming from your character. So you will want to turn this on, collision debugging, so you can go into game and see where that line's coming out from your character and how it's interacting with the things around it. Like, can it pick up the things that you're trying to interact with? And do those things have collision? And how wide a catchment area is that collision, right? That's going to affect what you can and can't collide with / interact with, okay? So with that all done, let's now go into first person and take a look at that, because it works very differently. So here we are now in first person free movement, and this is obviously a mode where a lot of people have issues with interactable objects. So as I say, I will explain a little bit about how free movement interaction works in first person, but what I will suggest is that this is where my custom function really comes in, because not only will it help with standard free movement, but it will also really help with first person free movement. But you'll notice there's no line. This line that you're seeing is not the interaction line, this little yellow one here. This is actually, if we went back into standard, you may have already noticed it when I was doing the video, when I was showing off the standard stuff. You might have seen that there were some other shorter yellow lines that were coming out from the body section of the model. I'm not sure what those lines are. I think they're just sort of detectors for, to be honest, I'm not 100% sure. I'd have to check with Justin what these ones are. But anyway, the way free movement works is actually very simple. Even though you can't see, sorry, first person, I said free movement. The way first person works is actually a lot simpler than standard. There's no interaction line coming down from the player's eyes. It's actually the center view of the camera. So in other words, imagine where the crosshair would be. So in other words, if I go into the game, let's do it this way, not the game, the editor. Let's go for UI. Let's just create a new UI element for a moment, widget. And we'll make it 1, turn off title bar, make sure it's in the center of the screen. Oh, and I need to show the widget. Show widget, what did I call it? I called it cursor, there you go. So, I don't want to show the cursor, so let me turn off now. Let me put that on, and that's probably all I need to do. Just mouse pass through. Let's try that again. Show widget cursor. prefer that. There we go, that's better. So we now have, to all intents and purposes, a makeshift crosshair, okay? So this crosshair dictates the interaction line. In other words, I'm currently, imagine a line going out from my crosshair. It's hitting the brush of the tree, right? The bush of the tree, sorry. Now, the line goes out a tile's distance. So it's not actually hitting the tree right now, but it's going out in that straight line direction. It's not going down at a 45-degree angle. Imagine it's a straight line. Imagine you've got a pole attached to your nose. So if you are looking straight ahead, then the pole is going straight ahead. The moment you look down at a 45-degree angle, now that pole is looking straight down at that tile over there. So in other words, wherever this cursor is looking, that's like the tip, the far end tip of the interaction line. Okay, so that would now be pointing towards Sarah. It's not hitting Sarah because she's more than 16 voxels away. But if I was to move within range, now potentially I'm hitting Sarah. Now, I haven't set up any interaction ability on Sarah, so that's it. We can't tell that. But let's go across the bridge. Okay, so here we are, for example, with the torch. Okay, so I'm going to look in the direction of the torch. There's currently no interact prompt in the far bottom right of the screen. I can't point anymore because the cursor's attached to the camera. But you'll see there's no interaction prompt. Okay, now if I start to move closer while looking at the model, eventually I will hit the collision of the plinth and the interact prompt appears. Now if I start to move off of the model, notice how the moment my cursor, crosshair, whatever, goes off of the model, that interact prompt disappears. So I'm same distance, I haven't stepped anywhere, but I'm now just slightly looking off of the model. So I'm going to move it slightly back on, boom, interact appears. Because now the line that's coming out from the vision of the player in first person, that straight line, is hitting the model. If I go slightly up, as soon as I go off, see how the fire, there's two, on the far right, there's two fire cubes. See how the one at the top is flicking on and off. And see how when it flicks off, you can see the blue collision mesh, right? So as soon as I take this cursor off of that blue collision mesh, look in the bottom right of the screen. Boom, it's gone, right? Because I'm now no longer colliding. My view is no longer colliding with the model. And that's how it works in free movement, okay? And in first person, it's all about where you're looking, right? So you could be this chest, for example. Okay, I'm obviously too far away from it. There you go. If I'm not looking at it, right, I can't interact with it because the vision of the player is hitting the wall, it's going in the direction of the wall. As soon as I come down, now I can interact with the chest because I'm close enough to it where the line hits it, but I'm also looking in the direction of it, right? So these are the two things you've got to understand about first person. Is it's not only the distance, but it's also you have to be looking at the object in such a way that your line hits the collision, okay? So, if we had a little teeny tiny cube, let's say this was interactable, okay? Not only do I have to be a distance away from this cube in order to have the line hit it, not only do I have to be looking at it, but I have to be looking at it in such a way that the line is lining up with the collision, right? So if you're not doing all three of those things, and to be fair, if you don't have this debug mode on, you're not going to see that you're doing that or not. So I can understand why it's a fiddly process, right? But this is how it works. So just understand that. Now, as I say, a simple way to resolve that is to just use a custom collision mesh that's larger than the model itself that gives you just a bit more of a capture zone for your collision. So for example, let's go back to our torch. Or in fact, let's do the chest because the chest is a little bit fiddly, I've noticed. So let's go to the map editor. In first person, the chest is particularly fiddly, so let's just do that. So we'll go to the chest and we'll put custom mesh on it. Custom cube. This time, however, we'll make it, I don't know, what is it, 8? No, 8, not 18, 8, I said. 8, so it's just about the height of the cube, but we'll leave it at that size so that we get all of the, all of the, well, actually, no, let's use 16 just to show how, how it will definitely impact first person. So let's go back across the bridge and take a look at the collision mesh of the chest, right? You can already see how much larger it is. Let's put the cursor back on screen. Technically it's a crosshair, but I called it cursor, but you get the idea. Right, so I'm obviously 16 away. I'm more than 16 voxels away from it. That's why I can't currently interact with it. But I'm now going to look at the wall, okay? I'm not going to look at the chest at all. I'm just going to look at the wall and walk forwards. But now I can interact because I'm now less than 16 voxels away, so I'm within the interaction range. But now the big collision box of the chest is now taking up the same visual space that I would have been looking at the wall. So now I can interact with the chest from a vision height, but a focal height, if you will, where I'm looking with my eyes above the chest, but I can still interact with the chest because the collision is taking that into account. But I don't have to be looking at the chest in order for it to detect the collision. I've made the collision in such a way that it's a little bit more free flowing than that. But obviously it goes without saying that obviously because the collision mesh is bigger, I can't get past it. So, you do have to be a little careful with it, but it just comes to understanding what is going on. So in this case, all I would need to do is just shrink the collision to hug the sides of the cube and maybe lower the height just a little bit. But then I'd have a much more generous interaction space without taking up too much space. The point was just to show you exaggerated how it impacts the ability to interact. See how I'm not even looking at the chest anymore. I'm now looking off to the side and above, but I can still interact with it because essentially the collision mesh is giving me all of this extra space that's all part of the object that I can interact with, okay? As soon as I move the cursor off of this bounding box, I now can't interact with it anymore. Pressing B does nothing, right? So that is how free movement interaction works, okay? Both for standard and free movement, first person. First person is a straight line coming out of the nose of the center point of the vision of the player. So use a widget like this to help you diagnose what you're looking at and what you're pointing at. And for standard, it's a line that comes down from the vision height of the player. And remember that if you change vision height in first person, it will just lower your camera. So this will still be, vision height will still affect where this dot comes from, but it's also going to affect the height of you in first person anyway. So it's going to have very little difference to how first person works, other than I would be lower down to the ground as a whole with the camera. So just understand that, right? If I go to my player model and change the vision height to 4, let's say, in first person, I'm actually at 4 in terms of height of the player. So it doesn't affect the actual workings of the first person, not show cursor, show widget. It doesn't actually affect how the detection works in first person. It just affects the height of everything as a whole. So this is still going to come out the same rules in first person still apply. This comes out of the center of the view of the player and the distance. And when you hit a collision box and when you're not aiming at a collision box, it still applies. It's just now you are at a different height, right? So vision height will affect this line, but in first person, it affects everything anyway. So that's what I was basically trying to get at. But in standard mode, vision height will affect the model and where the line comes from, okay? Now, let's just reset this for a moment. Back to 12. And let's quickly talk about something. So here we are back again. So now you know how free movement interaction works, both standard and first person. Now, this might just be enough for you to diagnose the problems that you've got with your particular interactables and fix them and get them to a point where they work. However, that being said, it is still, as you can see, a little bit of a fiddly system because especially in first person, you not only have to be a certain distance away, but you also have to be looking at the object. Now, you can get around the looking at the object by making the collision a bit bigger, and that will sort of resolve that problem. But maybe you don't want to make the collision bigger, right? Because in this case, it's getting in the way. I can't get past it. Now, I've already talked about how we could resolve this a little bit by shrinking the collision in a bit, but maybe you just don't want to do that. You want to keep the collision as it is, but you just want to resolve. You just don't want to use the fiddly, system of you have to be looking at it, the cursor, the interaction line has to hit it, and all of that. Now we know how it works. We could actually change the way it works. So what I want to talk about now is a custom function that you can write that you can use instead, so we can make our own interaction function for free movement that's going to actually make interacting with things just a lot easier. Make it a little bit more like the way grid works, but in free movement. So let me show you how we're going to do that. We'll go to the script editor now and we'll make a custom function. So before we get to the coding, I want to introduce you to a really awesome function which is basically going to make all of this work for us. I just need to give these IDs. So let me just do that. Torch 1, chest 1. Here we are in a first-person game, right? Now, I am miles away from the torch and the chest, okay? You can see them there, but they're across the bridge, and I'm not, my interaction line is going to be nowhere near them, right? However, if I bring down the console, in version 1.1 of RPG in a Box, in update version 1.1, a very useful scripting command was added. Interact with entity. This allows you to remotely trigger the interact event from an entity. Okay, so I can type, for example, entity torch 1, and if you look over at the torch, as soon as I press enter, the torch goes out. Now ignore the collision. That's because obviously the collision for the flames is still there. But if you didn't have the collision mesh on, in terms of the visibility of the collision mesh, it would look like the flames had just gone out. Okay, same with the chest. If we interact with entity chest 1, we should get a display message pop up. Hello world. We are literally using the chest, but from here. Okay. Now, if that hasn't already sunk in how useful that would be for free movement interaction, now we'll get into our function. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that scripting command, and we're going to make a much more flexible, i.e. it's less restricted, it's less strict. It's not that it's restricted necessarily, but unless you're looking at the right place and you're a certain distance away and all of that, then free movement, the base standard free movement interaction can be a bit fiddly to use. We can get around that if we just don't use the built-in interaction functionality, and we script our own instead. Now it's actually quite simple to make, but it's just there's a few things we need to check for. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the game configuration panel. We're going to go to global functions, and we'll make this a custom function, because that way we can just keep calling it whenever we want to interact with something. Okay. Well, to be more precise, we're going to bind this to a key so that when we interact, it will trigger this script. So we're going to call this something that it obviously can't be called interact, because there's already an interact function in RPG in a Box. So I'm going to call this function, I'll just call it custom use for now. Obviously you can call it whatever you want as long as the name is available. And then you're going to type begin, and then just make sure you put an end at the end. That way you don't have to worry about it later. Go in between, press tab. So what we're going to do is quite a few things. First thing we're going to do is we're going to store the player's tile, and we're going to type $player tile. So the local variable called player tile is going to equal tile. So tile open and close square brackets. And then we're going to feed into that the coordinates of the player the coordinate of the player. So the X, the Y, and the Z. So this will just check where is the player currently standing and store that in a local variable. Then we're going to do a series of separate checks, okay, and build a list of objects. So in this case, if player tile dot north tile dot objects is not null. So in other words, is there an object on the tile in front of the player? End that. If there is, then we want to store the north object into a variable called north object. So that's going to be $player tile dot north tile dot objects 0. So now that object that's on the tile, if there is one, to the north of the player will be stored in that variable. Okay, and we're going to do that 3 more times for the other cardinal directions. So if player tile east tile objects is not null, then east object will make a variable called east object equals player tile east tile dot objects. Okay, and you're just going to repeat this for south and west. I'll explain what this does when we're finished. Let me just, because I need to concentrate as I finish this off, but then I'll explain what essentially this is doing. It should be pretty self-explanatory, but I'll talk about it anyway. Right, so what we're basically doing is we're grabbing the coordinate of the player, or the tile of the player to be more precise, and then we're checking the tile to the north, and if there's an object there, storing it as a separate variable, north object. Then we're checking if there's an object to the east. If there is, store that as a separate object. If there's an object behind, store that as well. And if there's an object to the west, store that as well. So if we're standing on a tile that's in the middle of 4 objects, one to the north, one to the east, one to the south, and one to the west, they'll all be stored and they'll all be available. We'll have a north object, we'll have a west object, we'll have a south object, and we'll have an east object. Or if you're just standing in front of something but there's nothing to the sides or behind you, then you'll just have a north object, right? So it's not a else or type of condition. We're just grabbing anything that's around us. If that's 4 things, then we'll have 4 things. If there's just one thing that's in front of you and there's nothing to the side of you or behind you, then you'll only have one thing, right? However, that's just grabbing them. Now we need to actually do something with them. So the final thing we're then going to do is we're now going to check the player's direction. If player direction is north, then we don't want to trigger the interaction for the thing behind us if we're not looking at it. If we're not facing it, then we shouldn't be able to. The south object should not be being triggered, right? This is basically to stop all the objects being triggered that are detected around us. We only want to trigger one of them. And it makes sense it would be the one you're looking at. I want to open a door, look at the door, right? So if player direction is north, then if the north object is not null, so i.e. there was one when it did the grabbing of all the objects, then now we want to interact with entity $north object. Okay, and basically we're going to repeat that else if player.direction is equal to east, then we then need to copy this. We need to check the east object that it's not null before we then interact with the east object. So I'm going to go through now off camera because otherwise this will be a bit tedious. I think you get what we're going to do. We're just going to do an else if player direction equals south, if south object not null, interact with entity south object, etc. until we've got all of the cardinal directions. Okay, so I'll see you back when this is done. So I had to make a slight adjustment. Be very careful the way I'd done it initially. You might get an error saying with the if here function name exists. It's because I'd formatted the function slightly wrong. I'd put the end here and therefore I'd ended the function and the if was a new function. you need to make sure that the end that's in line with the function name is at the very bottom, and the if is jogged in line with this if. Okay, so these ifs get closed, and then this if opens but gets closed here, and then each if inside is closed itself. Yeah, makes sense? And then the final end here closes the whole function. Okay, but this is our finished function now. Now, obviously, this is a very simple implementation of it just for the video, but let me quickly explain how this works, and then I'll talk about how you could embellish it a bit more. So basically what this function is going to do is it's going to grab the coordinate of the player where they're currently standing when they press the use key, and then it's going to check the tile in front, or to the north to be more precise, and if it finds an object, it's going to store it. It then, separately to that afterwards, checks the tile to the east. If there's an object there, it stores that as well. It then checks the tile to the south. If it finds an object, it stores that. And if it checks the tile to the west and there's an object there, it stores that as well. Then, after it does that, it then checks, where are you facing? Are you facing north? In which case, it then assumes you want to interact with the north object. So then it checks, did I find a north object? If I did, then trigger the interact with the entity. If it's not an interactable object, don't worry, it won't error, it just won't do anything, okay? Otherwise, it will check, east, south, etc., and allow you to interact with that object. So this way, you can only interact with the object that you're facing, okay? Now, what this function doesn't currently cater for is characters, okay? So if you wanted to add characters to this, what I would do is do a separate lot of these. So once you've done the objects, then do 4 separate variables for the characters. So you would repeat this, you'd copy this text, paste it again underneath. So copy, paste like this. And then you would do if player tile north tile dot characters not equal to null, then $north character equals player tile north tile character 0. And you do that for all 4 cardinal directions again. So you'd have a $north object and a $north character, a $east object and a $east character, a $south object and a $south character, and a $west object and a $west character. Now, what you would need to decide is the hierarchy for your game. So, because you can only unless you want to be able to interact with both a character and an object at the same time, you probably don't want to be triggering 2 scripts at the same time. Like if you want, for example, you're trying to talk to a character, but you open a door as well, that would be a bit annoying. So you've got to decide if there's an object and a character on the same tile, which should take priority, a character or an object. So you would decide that. So let's say you say, oh, if a character's on the tile, they always take priority because they can obviously walk off the tile and then the object would have priority. So you would say if player direction equals north, then you would say if south character is not null, then interact with the character. Else if the object is not null, interact with the object. Okay, so that would be your sort of fail-safe for each direction. Hopefully that makes sense. If you want me to actually write a function, edit this function, and put it on the forum or something for you to grab that does that, then let me know. But it should be pretty self-explanatory how you would, embellish this out once you've written it and you understand how it works. So if we validate this now, we now have a function called custom use. And what we can do is we can make a script, very quick script, which we'll call custom use, may as well. Doesn't have to be named the same thing, but it just makes more sense. And it's just going to call our function. Okay, and we'll apply and save that. And then what you can do is you can go to your input bindings in game configuration, make sure you're on free movement in the scheme, and then find the E key where it says interact adjacent, change that to run script, and set it to custom use. Now we've got a custom interaction script. So let's go into game and I'll talk you through why it's better. So here we are in game. So let's just check by pressing E that it doesn't crash, because obviously that's the first thing to check, is make sure you haven't scripted anything that causes a crash. So the reason this is better is because you don't have to be directly looking at something, okay? The way this works is as long as you're Now ignore the interact prompt because it's still going to use the collision line. Okay, so this is appearing because we could actually interact with this now. Okay, but even if I, now this is a bad example because we made a huge collision box. Let's go over to this torch. Okay, so let's wait for the interact prompt to appear, right? This is appearing because we are looking in the vicinity of the collision mesh, right? But if I look slightly off to the side in such a way that the line is now no longer hitting the collision mesh, I shouldn't be able to interact with this torch, right? Because the line isn't hitting it, the collision isn't working, and all of that. In other words, the mechanics of the line hitting the collision, it's not going to do that. So if we were using the default free movement interaction mechanics, we now can't interact with this torch. So it's a little bit more fiddly. However, if we now press E, which instead is bound to our custom use function, he says, I missed out a very important, vital part of this, of course, and this is I came across this before when I was setting up this function. It's not enough to just write the function, okay? When it comes to north tile, west tile, east tile, and all of that, they only work when there's actual navigation, okay? So even though we're not using the grid, west tile, east tile, and all of that, they still use the navigation, okay? So what you want to do is switch to navigation tool in the editor and switch to the pending line. That way it doesn't make NPCs walk onto these things. And just make sure that there are lines connected from all aspects where you might want to interact with an object, okay? Now your west tile, north tile, east tile, etc. will find the tiles, find the objects, and all of that, okay? This is a very important step, and I was going to mention it, but I completely forgot and hit it sooner than I was expecting. I did completely forget this, but this is vitally important. Make sure that you have either, it doesn't matter what the lines are, whether they're pending, interact, walk and interact, because obviously free movement, you're not going to use them, but what you do need them for is for the west tile, north tile, east tile, etc. to find the tile that's to the north. If they're not connected on the navigation, then it will come back null, and therefore the objects will come back null and all of that. So connect them up. I use pending because then that means the NPCs won't walk onto them. Because obviously you have to remember the NPCs, if they're walking around, they will still use these lines, even if you're not. So if you don't want your characters walking into the chest and things, or into the torch, then use pending lines instead. Then nobody can walk in that direction except for you, but obviously you're going to hit the collision anyway. Right, now let's go into game. Right, so with that section, very vital section now remembered and implemented, let's go back to what I was saying earlier. So I'm now in proximity of this torch where I could interact with it, but now I'm going to not look at it, right? So the interact prompt in the bottom right has disappeared. So to all intents and purposes, if we were still using the default interact mechanics of RPG in a box, we shouldn't be able to interact with this torch now. But if I press E, now the torch turns off, okay? So I don't have to be directly looking at it. Now, as I say, one way to get around that is just to use a larger collision box, so you're always looking at it. See how the interact prompt has got a much wider scope of hitting the chest object. But if you don't want a huge collision, then I can do the same thing with the torch by just standing on the tile, in this case behind it, because it's we bring down the console, it found it to the east or west or wherever that can. I think it's north, east, west, south, and west. So it found it to the east. So it finds the object and then interact with entity torch lamp turns it off. So all you have to do is be looking in the direction. And you don't have to be spot on, you just have to be looking in the direction. So for example, if we print player.direction equals, print player direction. We're currently facing east, right? If I look slightly off here and print it, I'm still east. So that would still trigger the object. Let's turn a bit more. Where am I now? Still east. That would still turn off the torch. Let's turn a bit more. Still, I'm now south, so now that wouldn't have turned off the torch. But that makes sense because you're not looking at it anymore. So it's kind of intuitive why that if you pressed E now, it wouldn't turn off the torch, right? Because you're not really looking at it. But here, you would expect that to turn off the torch. And it would, because it falls into the category of you are looking east. So, this can be applied to doors. So, for example, let's go to the map editor again. Let's go over to this door. Let's turn it into a thingy. And a door. Okay. Door is only supported in free movement. That's fine. And then most importantly, don't forget, go to navigation mode, switch it to pending for now, and we'll draw a line under the door so we can interact with it. You don't need to give it an ID because it will just grab whatever object is on the tile. If we're standing here, it will find the object on the tile immediately around it. Okay? Okay, let's go back over to the door. Let's just try jumping across the lake. Okay, so here we are at the door. Okay, now I'm not looking in the direction of the door. Now, it might open the door because it depends what the game thinks our direction is. But no, I've just pressed E and it hasn't opened the door. Okay, but if I turn so the door is more in our line of sight, now the E interact prompt has not appeared. So if we were using the default mechanics, pressing E now would still not open the door. And it doesn't. Okay, now it does. Okay. Now remember, this is still not using the default interact prompt. So notice how here, for example, if we were using the default, apparently we could open it. But this is an instance where my function is yeah, here we go. My point was I was trying to get to a scenario where you can see the E interact prompt is not on screen, but you can open the door. Give it a go for yourself. I mean, I have found that this function is much more forgiving, okay? Because you don't have to be directly looking at the object. You can still interact with it. And even if you are directly looking at the object, you're guaranteed to open it, because as long as it's in the tile in front, you will open it, right? Or use it, whatever it is, whether it's a door, a chest, whatever. If we go up to this chest, press E as soon as we're in front, it will trigger. I don't have to be looking directly at it. I can just go up to this torch, press E, turn it off. It's so much quicker and easier. I can just walk up to something, press E, walk up to something, press E, walk up to something, press E, because I don't have to be directly aiming my interaction cursor at it, right? And you don't have to make the collision bigger in order to do so either. So you can keep the collisions as they are, but it just gives you a bit more flexibility, just a bit more forgiveness when it comes to interacting, because instead of you having to aim directly at it, you just have to be looking in the direction of the object. And if there is an object on the tile in front, just like it would be in grid mode, as long as it's in the tile in front, then it will interact. But the point is, it's a little easier to use because you don't have to actually be aiming at the collision precisely in order for you to be able to interact with it. So if you're having issues where you just can't seem to interact with an object, try this function, because this function means the object only has to be on a tile directly around you, and you just have to be looking in that camera direction, and that's all you need, and then it will interact with that object. But anyway, this video has been going on long enough. I just wanted to, first of all, talk about how free movement interaction works, and then show you at the very end a function that you could use if you wanted to. If you're really struggling to get interaction to work with free movement, especially first person, then a function like this would be really useful, because you're not stuck having to aim that interaction cursor so perfectly at an object before you can interact with it, okay? So it's not about the scale of the objects and all of that. It's about the collision and the line coming out of the vision of the player and what that's set to. So use the collision override settings as well, but also, more importantly, use this collision view here that allows you to see the boxes and the lines to see what's going on. And if you're in first person, I definitely recommend making a widget that is 1 by 1 and is in the center of the screen, and this will depict, make sure you've got mouse input pass-through on, otherwise your cursor will appear as well, which will mess things up. But you can use this to aim at things, and as long as you're 16 voxels away, or whatever the tile grid size you're set to is, as long as you're within a distance, then and your cursor is hitting, the crosshair is hitting the collision, then the interact prompt would appear, and you should be able to then interact with the item, whatever it is, character or object. Okay, but if you're even struggling with that, then the function should help you, because then you don't even need to be hitting the collision precisely. The object just needs to be the tile around you, and as long as you're looking in that direction, you'll interact with the object that's in that direction. The really nice thing about interact with entity, as I showed you earlier, is it can interact with anything from any distance. So use that to your advantage when you come to customizing your function, okay? Because it's going to help you. The ability to interact with something from wherever you are is really helpful, especially for things like this. So with that said, that will wrap up this video. I hope it's been useful and interesting and helped you out. If you have any questions on anything, feel free to ask on the Discord. I will potentially post the full function on the forum, and feel free to check that out if you want to use the function. So with that said, that'll wrap up this video. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next video.